All right, you're watching the Power Hour. I'm your host, DJ Larry Jones, and my next guest is a psychologist, and her name is Dr. Alyssa Deitchman. Did I say your last name right?
Yes, Deichman. Good job. It's a
Th-
hard one.
I didn't want to botch it. And she specializes in relationships and attachment. Today, she'll be helping us unpack interpersonal dependency, what it means, how it affects us, and how to build healthier connections. Dr. Alyssa, how are you?
I'm doing great today, Larry. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here
I want
and
to, I want
excited to talk.
yeah, I want to thank you for joining me today.
Of course, I'm proud to.
And before we get started, let's get into your backstory. How did you become Dr. Alyssa Deitchman?
So it's fairly simple. I was reading Psychology Today magazine when I was 15 at my parents' house, and it just kind of struck my interest. I was like, wow, this is such a vast field. There's so much to learn about human behavior and why we are the way we are, right? So ever since then, I kind of have been on that trajectory, right? Undergrad, master's, PhD, etc., because it's just something that I feel very passionate about. I love doing clinical work because I am a therapist, right? But I also love the research component, which is what we're going to be talking about today, my doctoral research on dependency, because it is a really nice balance of having the clinical skills, right? But also the scholastic abilities. So that's what drew me to get a PhD in clinical psychology. And despite how difficult it was, I'm glad that I did.
Right. I'm glad you did too. Now, today we're talking about interpersonal dependency. How would you define it?
Yeah, sure, Larry. So it's a very broad topic. So I'm going to give a very simplistic explanation. Okay. So interpersonal dependency is when we rely on others for support, decision making, and even our sense of identity and self. So to a certain extent, right, we are all social creatures.
Mhm.
We need other people, we need connection. But when dependency becomes excessive, it can actually lead to difficulty functioning well in society. So that's interpersonal dependency, a brief summary, right? Versus healthy interdependence, which is when relationships focus on like reciprocity, mutuality, right? Like you lean on each other for support. You don't need the other person, but you choose to depend on the other person, right? Whereas with dependency, Larry, it centers around a fear of abandonment. So do you see the
Yeah.
difference?
Yeah. What are some common signs that someone might be overly dependent on others in
Right.
relationships?
That's a great question too, Larry. So basically, a hallmark sign that someone is overly dependent in their relationships is that they have a really difficult time making even the smallest decisions without reassurance from someone else. That is the kind of hallmark symptom, if you will. And they also have this intense anxiety about being alone. And as a result of that, they avoid conflict and confrontation at all costs to preserve that connection, right? So, getting more specific, some common traits of people who are interpersonally dependent include needing constant reassurance and validation, feeling lost without that specific person in their lives, and even tolerating unhealthy dynamics or even
Hmm.
harmful dynamics for the sake of maintaining that dependency and that connection. And at this juncture in our conversation, I want to really highlight something is that dependency often disguises itself as love or
Mm,
loyalty, right? It can feel like,
yeah.
oh, I just am so loyal. I love this person so much. However, when our well being hinges entirely on someone else, that's problematic, right?
Big time. Big
That's
time.
super problematic. So that is to answer your question, some like common traits, but the biggest sort of symptom that really indicates it is if they have difficulty making even small decisions like, hey, what's the weather outside today? Asking a friend instead of Googling it, right? Like
Yeah.
little things like that, that we may just do unconsciously and not even notice. So,
Right.
yeah.
In what ways does interpersonal dependency develop? Is it more nature or nurture?
So, like most psychological phenomena, right, it's a combination of both. It's always both. So, in the case of dependency, one can have a genetic predisposition to anxiety or attachment related difficulties, right? that the environment then further shapes and reinforces and plays a huge role in. So, in the case of the development of dependency, it can develop from either a lack of nurturance and care when growing up in your childhood, or like excess nurturance and care. So, in the former, where there's a lack of care and connection, the child's emotional needs were not
Mm-hmm.
met by the parents, right? And as a result, they develop dependency as a defense mechanism to try to seek safety and stability, right? And in the case where there's coddling, right, excess nurturing, think of helicopter parents. The children are not allowed to make decisions for themselves. So as a result of that, Larry, they never develop this self trust. They never develop trust in themselves, which causes them to develop dependency, to use other people to guide them through life, right?
Right.
So it's ultimately about how someone relates to others based on past experiences, especially those early years, early childhood experiences. But I want to keep emphasizing that with effort, we can relate to others in healthier ways, right? This is static. We can change it.
Right. Now, I want to talk about self-esteem. What role does self-esteem play?
That's a really complicated and good question. So, a core belief of people who have interpersonal dependency related issues is that the self is hopeless and ineffectual, right? That's big. That's a really intense feeling. You feel
Yeah.
helpless and like you can't do anything on your own, right? So, if you want to frame it from that perspective, it's kind of rooted in that lack of not necessarily self-esteem but self-trust, right? Those
Right.
inner strengths, things like that. But as a sort of baseline, people who are interpersonally dependent do struggle with self-esteem because they are not able to function independently. They might not know that consciously, but that's how I see it.
Right. Now, there can be some triggers. What are some of the common emotional triggers that, for those who struggle with it?
Common emotional triggers. I think just the fear of abandonment. That is just such a big one. Whenever someone will say something even mildly critical, it will trigger those dependency needs, right? And those
Right.
feelings, motivations, behaviors. It might cause someone to reach out more. Hey, are you mad at me? Things like that.
Well, now, what would you say to someone who may be watching and they're dealing with this? What would you say to that person?
Well, it's really important to disentangle the underlying cause, right? So, like in therapy, it would take a lot of work. But the goal with therapy for someone who is interpersonally dependent is to increase their sense of autonomy and agency, to counteract that core belief that the self is helpless and ineffectual.
Right. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. We're running out of time. Dr. Alyssa Deitchman. If someone wants to reach you and just, talk to you about a few things, how can they do that?
Sure. So I'm currently working at the Center for Progressive Psychotherapy located in Chelsea, New York City. So you can find more about me on our website, which is www.cpp-nyc.com.
There you go. Dr. Alyssa Deitchman. I'm your host, DJ Larry Jones.
Thank you.